The following program is made possible by Wells Fargo. Wells Fargo, the next stage.
He's finishing up his first full term in the State Assembly, and all Rich Gordon has had to face is 2 budget crises and a vote on high-speed rail. He's here to talk about what he's learned in Sacramento. The game is politics, and the game is on. I'm Mark Simon. After 13 years on the San Mateo County Board of Supervisors, Rich Gordon was elected to the State Assembly in 2010, representing the peninsula and Silicon Valley. He wrote in an op-ed that he thought he knew what to expect when he went to Sacramento, but it turns out he was a little surprised. Rich, thanks for joining us.
Glad to be here.
I got to ask you, it wasn't what you expected when you first got up there, and I wonder if it still isn't quite what you expected.
It's a very interesting place in so many ways.
Interesting is such an interesting word, isn't
it?
Well,
yeah. I think, several things I didn't expect. I knew there was partisanship. I don't think I expected it to be as severe as it is. I knew that, there was a lot of work on legislation. I didn't realize that you deal with about 3,000 bills every 2 years. I don't really think I understood the workload or the work pace. And then finally, I don't think I understood kind of the fact that Sacramento is a kind of an insular world. Mm-hmm. When I'm there, I'm dealing with a small group of people and often disconnected from the rest of the state in many ways.
Is it better or worse than you thought, or is it a combination of the two?
It's a combination of the two. I mean, I have to say, initially, in the first few months, it was kind of like, oh my Lord, what have I done? Be careful what you ask for. But I think I've found my pace. I've found my niche. I think that I figured out how to be successful for my constituents and for California. So it's growing on me, and I'm enjoying it.
The public's view of the legislature is not good. It's an all-time low. It's actually lower than journalists, which is a sad commentary on our state of affairs. But what can be done to improve it, to improve the reputation? Are there changes within the structure of the legislature and how it does its business? And or does it require almost a wholesale change of attitude?
Well, I think there's several things. One is that I think there are changes that can be made by the legislature. One, I think greater transparency. I think that having legislation in print for longer periods of time, greater opportunity for people to examine what we're doing, more opportunities for public input would be helpful. I think it would be better, candidly, if we had a tighter limit on the amount of legislation that could be introduced, so we do fewer bills. I'd rather see more quality than quantity when it comes to legislation. I don't know how many more laws California needs.
One of the ballot measures in the November election is a reform that would structurally affect the legislature, which is a 2-year budgeting cycle. Is that something you think is a good idea? I
do. I actually support a whole host of budget reforms that I'd like to see. Mm-hmm. I do believe in a 2-year budget cycle. I think forcing the state to think longer term is better. And in those states that do a 2-year budget cycle, in the second year, when you're not working on the budget, you actually have the time to go in and review programs, get into what the activities are in the agencies and functions of state government. I think that's important. That's also why, as part of a budget reform, I would support performance-based budgeting. I think we need to be able to say, here's what we expect you to do with the tax dollar, and hold the state agencies accountable to that. That way, I can come back to the public and say, look, I know how your tax dollar is being spent.
You're on the Budget Committee. You're making it sound as though the budget, the annual decision about how to pass the budget, it dominates the agenda, that it's basically everything else derives itself from there. But isn't that the way it's supposed to be?
Well, it is supposed to be. I mean, the budget is the highest statement of our values. It really describes what we think is most important for California, because that's where we put our resources, our tax dollars. So it ought to be a thoughtful process. It ought to be a process that is deliberative, and it ought to be a process that takes up time. It's not something you should do quickly, lightly, and conveniently.
In the introduction, I talked about the vote on high-speed rail, and before we plunge into that subject, I should disclose that I work for Caltrain in my day job. But a lot of people are characterizing some of those votes as political courage. Was a no vote a political courage vote, or was a yes vote a politically courageous vote?
You know, I have to say, I think each of us comes to our votes in our own way, and whatever vote you take, when you take it, is a vote of courage, because whatever I do as a member of the legislature, I'm going to upset a certain group of people. Not everybody is unanimous in what we ought to be doing in California.
That always comes as a surprise to some elected officials, I think.
Well, I learned that early on.
Yeah.
You know, so it's not, my effort is not to please the majority. My effort is to try to faithfully represent my constituents and do what I think is best for the region I represent. And keeping that in mind, I was very comfortable with my vote on what we did relative to high-speed rail, because I think we did a great job for the peninsula.
Explain why you voted for it.
Well, first of all, I think it's important to understand, you know, what it was that we voted on.
For, yeah.
And what we voted for was to provide the funding, finally, to electrify Caltrain. Secondly, we provided a similar amount of funding to modernize rail service in the LA Basin. We voted on a set of transit projects that assist public transit agencies across the state through what was called the Connectivity Fund. And then finally, we voted to provide funding for a segment in the Central Valley, which I came to the conclusion actually has some utility and improves service, Amtrak service in that region. And perhaps most importantly, as part of the legislation, we guaranteed that the blended approach where high-speed rail and Caltrain share track, work together, cooperate, is the path forward on the peninsula.
Yeah. You mentioned first the Central Valley. A lot of people have characterized that as a train to nowhere. Why do you think it has utility? Because it actually upgrades Amtrak service? Is that the only reason?
No, I think there's a couple reasons. One is that that is one of the busiest, the segment between Bakersfield and Sacramento is one of the busiest Amtrak service segments in the entire United States. And it is severely incapacitated by having to share track with freight in a very busy freight zone. Mm-hmm. So building a separate track for passenger that Amtrak will use until high-speed rail someday is available will actually allow for an increase in passenger service in that region. And it also will allow for an increase in freight service in the region. And the more trucks we can get off of Highway 99 and Highway 5 by using freight rail instead, it also benefits that region, and it benefits in terms of its air quality. So I just felt that there were a whole host of things that actually made that a project that had utility.
We're going to take a quick break. Stay with us. We'll be right back. Welcome back to the game. I'm Mark Simon. We're joined by Assemblyman Rich Gordon, who's finishing up his first term in office, and we're talking about the vote on high-speed rail. And in the interest of full disclosure, I work for Caltrain, which is going to benefit from this. The way you described your vote and what you were voting for made it sound as though you were voting for everything but a high-speed rail plan. And at some point or other, people were going to say, wait a minute, first of all, this is just high-speed rail's way of getting in a place where people don't want it. And second of all, you shouldn't be able to take money that's supposed to be for high-speed rail and spend it on Caltrain, and spend it on LA Metro, and spend it on Amtrak in the Central Valley.
Well, these high-speed rail funds are being used in a way that prepares the Central Valley, LA, and this region for eventual high-speed rail. But we are going to be quite some time away from getting to high-speed rail. and particularly in this region, given the plan that's been adopted by the High-Speed Rail Authority. We're only short another $60 billion to be able to do high-speed rail in California.
That sounds like a big number to me.
It's a huge number, and where those dollars come from, none of us know. So we use the funds that were available to us now, that could only be used on these kinds of rail projects, couldn't be used for any other purpose, wouldn't help us with education, wouldn't help us with parks.
I'm sorry, but say that again, because a lot of people criticize the plan and saying, when we need money for our schools, why don't we take this money? Let's assume that the legal issue of the voters voted to allocate this money for high-speed rail is resolved. Why can't the specific funds in some way, even by a vote of the public, be reallocated towards something else?
Well, you would have to go back to the public and say, the bond, the funding authority that you were given, which is an authority for rail only, we want you to do something different with it. But for now, under the law, these funds need to be spent on rail. And that's what they were designated for. So we couldn't have used them for other government purposes. Now, in all candor, these are bond funds. That means it's money we borrowed or will be borrowing. There's a debt service on that, and that has some impact on the general fund. But the debt service is programmed into the state budget. It has been planned, so we're prepared for that.
Yeah. The other lingering issue still is that it's really not a two-track proposal. It's somehow or another still going to be four-track. That at some point or another, someone will force it to be four-track. That high-speed rail still wants it to be four-track on the peninsula. And I gather there were safeguards put into this law that satisfied that question in your mind.
I believe that the legislation that we passed clearly delineates that this, from here forward, we move into a blended system with Caltrain and high-speed rail eventually, sharing a corridor that is within the existing right-of-way owned by Caltrain. It doesn't require any expansion, doesn't require additional property, and that right-of-way can't handle 4 tracks. We also, said that no aerial structures, so you couldn't put tracks on top of each other, except in those places where communities want that. So it really is a community decision. The other important thing is that a lot of folks don't understand, nothing was changed in our environmental review process by approving these funds, particularly the funds to electrify Caltrain. There will be a full environmental review. Communities along the peninsula will have an opportunity to understand, discuss, and comment on the environmental impacts of electrification.
Let's shift gears a little bit and talk about the state budget. It is balanced precariously. And basically, as they say in Vegas, you're betting on the come, that this ballot measure in November that's going to increase income taxes on people making more than $250,000 is going to pass and generate the revenue that balances the budget. Is that a responsible way to balance a budget?
Well, we could have made cuts now, but that would have meant that if the tax measure passed, we would have stopped a whole set of activities and had to restart. I think it is more responsible to keep those activities going until the point that the citizens decide what they want to spend on their government. And if the citizens say yes to the tax measure that's on the ballot, proposed by the governor, then schools receive continued funding. The other activities that we identified that would be cut if the funding doesn't occur would continue. If we don't get the tax measure passed, there's a set of activities, including funding for schools, funding in public service, that would be cut.
Why not just cut? Why not? The household example everybody loves to use is that when my income goes down, I have to cut my expenditures. Why not just do that and not raise taxes? Why not just live within your means? I mean, it sounds like you're, like in a household, you're still going to spend money on upgraded cable, but you're going to keep buying lottery tickets and hope that you cash them in.
Well, let me point out that when I got to Sacramento, Governor Brown had just been elected, and there was an immediate announcement that the state faced almost a $27 billion deficit. That's a structural problem, long-term structural problem that we have in the state of California, that we've been spending more than we take in. We've reduced that structural deficit in the last 2 years by 75%. We've made significant cuts. We've already cut in education. We've cut in health. We've cut in welfare. And so I think we've kind of reached a point where if you're going to deal with solving a structural deficit problem, you've got to do two things. You can't probably achieve it all by cuts. You've also got to raise some revenue. And so I think that this is a responsible plan that's been proposed, because we've made cuts. We're asking for more revenue. And obviously, if we don't get the additional revenue, we'll have no choice. There will be further cuts. And we've described what we think those are going to be.
We're going to take another break. Don't go away. And you stick around too. We'll be right back.
It's been over 150 years since Wells Fargo first opened for business. Since then, we've enjoyed your community support, and we're passionate about returning it. Every day, Wells Fargo team members roll up their sleeves and donate their time to organizations and charitable groups throughout the Bay Area. Nationally, we've committed even more. In just the past 2 years alone, we've donated over $70 million to support schools and educational programs. It's a commitment we're proud of. Wells Fargo, the next stage.
Welcome back to the game. I'm Mark Simon. Over here we have Assemblyman Rich Gordon, who's been kind enough to join us today. We were talking about the state budget. Everything really hinges on the governor's tax measure. What's your sense of that piece of legislation? Is it fair? It reminds me of the line from the novel All the King's Men. We're going to soak the fat boys and spread it out thin. Is it really fair? Is this the right way to go about trying to balance the state budget?
Well, the measure has a combination. It has an slight increase in sales tax, which impacts everybody. And then it has an increase on those in our society here in California who are doing the very best in terms of their financial situation. I think that's fair. And I think what makes it even more fair is the fact that it is for temporary purposes. So these taxes expire. The sales tax at 5 years, the income tax at 7. So there's a time limit to this. And that again goes back to the fact that we're trying to solve the structural deficit. That gives us the time to continue to restructure state government, to make additional changes, and to get our house back in order.
I guess the question is, why should the public trust that that's what's going to happen? We talked at the top of the show about the low public opinion about the legislature. You've talked a little bit about some of the difficult and partisan environment that it's up there. Why should we think this is going to do any better, even if you have some time to do it? I can envision a scenario where the economy rebounds dramatically. Suddenly there's lots of money and nobody fixes anything.
Well, I think that if we don't trust that this is going to work, then we might as well give up on California. Mm-hmm. I certainly understand the cynicism that exists at the moment in our society. There's this great sense that no one is working on our behalf, that we're kind of alone and struggling in our own homes, in our own financial situation. But at some point, we have to take a leap of faith. We have to trust that this is going to work. And we have to hold our elected officials accountable to that. If I don't produce the kinds of changes that need to occur, then folks ought to kick me out of office.
Well, one of the things that undermines what you're saying and enhances the cynicism is something like what happened with the state parks rainy day fund and the $54 million. I don't know how they would define a rainy day if they hadn't just been through one where they had to resort to private fundraising to keep some of these treasured state parks open. But that's got to be something that just makes you cringe.
Oh, it makes me stark raving crazy. Even more so in that I chair the budget committee that oversees the parks. And in a budget hearing this past spring, I said to the director of parks, I'm kind of struggling to understand your budget because it seems to me that we ought to be bringing in more fees at the entry gate than we're currently doing. Well, it turns out we were.
And they were just squirreling the
They
money.
just hadn't been reported.
Wow.
And I think that the lesson to be learned here is twofold. One, there's a disconnect in our state administration between various functions. The folks who account for the money aren't the same folks who do the budgeting, and they weren't communicating with each other. The other dynamic is that I've been calling for, and as part of what I think needs to be appropriate budget reform, more scrutiny by the legislature. Let's dig deeper. Let's ask more questions. Let's take more time. I've done that in my budget subcommittee. I'm going to continue to do that as a member of the budget committee.
The other thing where you hear the cynicism expressed is in the public employee pensions. They threaten to bankrupt a lot of public agencies, not just the state government. You see some agencies that are making employees pay the employee share, which always sounds like a discordant note for somebody in private enterprise because they're paying the full employee share. Is this the next big wave? If the legislature doesn't do something about this soon, what are the consequences budgetarily and also politically?
Well, it is something that has to be resolved. And I, for one, believe that before the end of August, there will be a legislative package adopted. It will be based on the principles laid out by the governor in a 12-point plan, which I think go a long way to providing reform. There's some other things I would probably want to add to that, and I know that there are others who are going to want to adjust some of that. We've had a conference committee working on this issue. Their report will be presented to us in August, and there'll be something for us to vote and discuss.
Are the pensions too rich?
Candidly, not for the average employee. When statewide, an average public employee is getting about $30,000 a year in pension if they retire. The real problem is at the extremes. Mm-hmm. And there have been excesses. There's been spiking of pensions. That's where I think the major problem is. I also happen to think that we have to have employees participating more in this system. They need a stake in the game.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about one of your other positions, which is chair of the LGBT caucus. Two recent public figures disclosed they were gay, Anderson Cooper, it was disclosed, and Sally Ride. But what was interesting about it, given your own personal history and how you had to go about disclosing that when you first ran for office, is that it was much more sort of low-key, matter of fact. Anderson Cooper sort of said it almost offhandedly, and it only came out after Sally Ride passed away, but it wasn't about, it was a revelation so much as, yeah, she had been all along and just didn't feel compelled to make an issue of it, nor make a secret of it. And I wondered if there are those in the gay community who say, no, they should have been public, they should have been continuing the pioneering effort. But I wonder if the dynamic is changing and it is more of a sort of offhand, matter of fact, just the way life is sort of a thing.
Well, I think certainly here in California, one of the things that has happened is that as gay and lesbian individuals have been more and more open, people understand that we are your neighbors, your friends, participants in the community, participants in our economy, and there's a level of awareness that is different when folks hide. And so I think those who courageously came out in the early parts of the gay and lesbian strive for human rights and equality have given us a platform that others now stand on.
Yeah. You married your partner Denny in 2008. In fact, your anniversary is just a little more than a month away. You better not forget.
It's on the calendar.
2 months later, Prop 8 passed, and I know that was part of what prompted you to do to get married when you did. Will same-sex marriage be legal in California, and how soon do you think that might happen?
I believe that we are on a path where same-sex marriage will be legal in the United States. I candidly have to tell you that I never thought that this would happen in my lifetime. And so the speed at which this is beginning to shift and the speed at which public opinion has shifted, I think partially goes back to what I talked about in terms of folks knowing gay and lesbian people. I think that's made a huge difference. And I also think that the attitudes of younger people have made a huge difference.
I have to stop you there. Rich Gordon, thank you so much for joining us today. And thank you for being with us. Join us next time on The Game.